Okay, welcome everybody. If anyone would like to come near the front, feel free to move now, or during the talk when we're going to be showing some of the resource if you can't see it very well from the back. Can everybody hear me? Down the back, yeah? Good. My name is Anne O'Keefe and this is Geraldine Mark. Both of us have been involved for the last number of years, 4 or 5 years, on an exciting project looking at English grammar. This is part of a very large project called English Profile, funded by Cambridge English and Cambridge University Press. Cambridge University Press commissioned us to look in detail at the Cambridge Learner corpus and to see what learners can actually do at each of the CEFR levels. So as such, it was an attempt to put the Common European Framework descriptors to use them, but also to give more detail based on the learner data that Cambridge has as part of the Cambridge Learner corpus. So what came out of all of that research was what we have now is a large database which contains 1,222 grammar descriptors. And this is the English Grammar Profile. So you can look up any one of the CEFR levels and you have then a listing of what learners can do at each level. Okay, and that's what we're hoping to illustrate in this talk. And we want to see how this might prompt us to reflect on how we can improve our syllabus design. And we hope that you may also have ideas based on our presentation. If you have a tablet, you may want to look up the resource if you Google English Grammar Profile online, because it might be easier to see on your tablet. English Grammar Profile online. It's not so clear on the phones, but English Grammar Profile online, and we'll show you the page in a matter of as part of the presentation. So an important distinction here is that as language teachers, we think we know a lot about what learners know and can do in terms of grammar. So we can use our intuition, we can think through our experiences of teaching, and we can look at the materials and the various syllabi. So we can think of a grammar form and say, well, learners usually know that around B1, or they usually know that by A2. So we have a lot of useful intuition to draw on. So what the English Grammar Profile does is actually tell us what learners seem to know based on their Cambridge exam data. So it's providing evidence for us in terms of the output, the learner output. It's a corpus-informed profile of what the learners can do. So it's what we know learners can do. But it's based on written output. We would highlight that. It's based on the written Cambridge exams, the open parts, not the gap fills. Okay, so just to give the background then, for those of you who are not aware of the Cambridge Learner Corpus, it's a 55 million word resource containing the Cambridge exams across the CEFR levels. It's an important point to say it's a learner corpus that's linked to the CEFR levels because a lot of learner corpora are not. And that allows us then to stratify our research to align it to the CEFR levels. It contains over 200,000 exam scripts across 140 or more first languages and across 200 countries. So it's a really interesting database to have access to. It's been really interesting to do this research and to look at the data across such a broad sample. Now, we're actually going to go straight to the resource. First of all, what do you think you know about learners at B1? What do you think they know about the conditionals at B1? So if you think about conditionals, it's something we all teach in grammar. What conditionals do learners at B1 typically know? What's your intuition about that? And then we'll go straight into the resource and see what the resource tells us based on our detailed research into conditionals within the learner data. So just think for a minute. What do learners know about conditionals at B1 level? Maybe turn to the person beside you. What conditionals do they typically know at B1? What's your intuition? So do you want to just say that the page, that's what it looks like when you look it up? Yeah, I can do you want to do that? Yeah, we'll be fiddling, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So you'll have an idea in your head of what you expect learners to be able to do with the conditionals at B1. But what we want to do is go straight into the resource now and see whether or not what we've found matches what your experience and intuition have led you to come up with. So if you do have a tablet or a laptop or something, feel free to look up English Grammar Profile. If you get to the home page, you click on this tab here which says English Grammar Profile. Go below and click on English EGP Online. And you'll see here we've got let's go with the level B1. We can click on any level of the Common European Framework, and then we'll click on this button here, Add Filters. Sorry, Anne, we don't do that. And we can click on this area here, which gives us a drop down of 20 main areas of grammar. We choose clauses here. Having chosen clauses, now all of the relevant categories related to clauses will appear in the subcategory menu. So we'll now choose conditional clauses. And we see there, if you scroll down, the results here are everything that a B1 learner can do with conditionals. If we went to A1, we would see what A1 learners can do with conditionals. We go to A2, we'd have an accumulative collection of statements about what learners can do. The thing that strikes us there, and what we found, is that we're not finding just one or two things. We're finding conditionals being used in many, many contexts. We're looking more at the notion of the if clause and how the if clause functions. And I think perhaps you might say, just give me a kind of a random shout out of what you thought learners would be able to do. Would anybody like to suggest what they thought learners could do with conditionals at this stage?
0 and first.
0 and first.
Maybe second.
Maybe second, but not third?
No.
Okay, so if we go down, interestingly enough, if we go down to the bottom here, we've got first, we've got second, and we've got third, evidence of third there. Now, the important thing to say here as well, which I just touched on, is that as well as these first, second, third, 0, interspersed with that, we've got other uses of if clauses. So first of all, it tells us perhaps that there's more to the conditional than the 0, first, second, third, which is not news to a lot of people. But also, if we go into the detail on the third conditional here, and go down to the bottom, that we have the facility in this resource to comment on our findings. And so here at the bottom, you won't be able to read it here, perhaps you won't be able to read it here. The resource is designed for individual use, so showing it on a screen isn't ideal, but it gives you the idea. That we often find the third conditional typically taught at B2, but we found plenty of evidence for it at B1. So that in itself was an interesting finding, that perhaps our learners can do more than we think they can. Perhaps the input is coming from somewhere else. So obviously it raises the issues of input and output and implicit and explicit learning and all of this kind of stuff. So that's just a quick whiz through what the resource looks like. We'd urge you to go off and look at it individually. We've identified 20 main areas of grammar, which are tenses, word classes, clauses, all the kind of typical things that you'd expect to find. And we've
gone through each of these levels with a fine-tooth comb, analysed the data and produced a set of descriptive statements about what learners can do. And that's an important point there. It's a description. It's not designed to be prescriptive. It's what we found learners can do, not what we think they should be doing. So we're just going to give you a little snapshot of some of the findings, and we've just decided to put it in the context of nature because we found there were emerging things about the nature of learner grammar. So the first one to point out was this notion of grammatical polysemy. I mean, and many of you will understand the term polysemy in terms of vocabulary development, where you have something like the word bark, which is used as a noun typically to talk about a tree, the bark of a tree, but also as a verb, the dog barks, but also figuratively, get out of the room, she barked. So that kind of use as well. So we've got a polysemic use of bark there, but we're also finding the same thing with grammatical forms. For example, this grammatical form here, this adverb and adjective combination. When we started looking at word classes, we first of all identified the item of the word class, so something like an adjective, and we looked at how adjectives were being used. But then we also wanted to see how adjectives were being used in phrases. So this particular study that we did was about the combination of adverbs and adjectives. And as you can see, we've got some nice uses there at A1 and A2 level. My home is very nice. This is a very nice neighbourhood. And then at A2, I'm really happy to see you. It's really nice that you come to visit me. So we're seeing these adverb-adjective combinations being used in a clause as well. So if we were to say, when can learners use an adjective and an adverb? We'd say, well, A1. And then we'd move on to another grammatical form. But that's not the full picture. If we look at what learners can do with the same form at higher levels, we're starting to see a much more complex, much more specialised use of this adjective and adverb combination. So rather than say, right, as soon as we can see a form or a use of a form being used at a certain level, the English grammar profile isn't satisfied that that's the complete picture. We want to see what learners are doing with every aspect of grammar at every single level. So as we can see here, we've got much more of a pragmatic use of this combination. Painfully obvious that. Highly unlikely that, but the grammatical form is the same, but what they're doing with it, same form, different function, we're seeing evidence of pragmatic development here. And the growth of vocabulary and grammar being so intrinsically interlinked, we cannot separate them. As learners go through the level and they learn more grammar, they're learning more vocabulary, and you're getting this kind of almost movement from the middle of the core outwards. And we've tried to show this in the profile all the way through by showing grammar related to lexical range as well. So if you have a look at the profile, and you can go into one of the tenses and you'll be able to see that, for example, at present simple, we might see learners using the present simple competently at A level, but with a limited range of vocabulary. And so that we wanted to be able to show that there was a growth and a development. So this is what this image is kind of trying to show. I'll move back to Anne now, who's going to talk a little bit about the errors and peaks and troughs and errors that we find in learner grammar.
Okay, great. I'll stay on this side for now. So yeah, it's interesting when you look at what learners can't do well, when you look at the errors, it can be troubling. For example, the past simple. This is a graph of the past simple errors. So the errors at A1 are along here, A2 along here, and then B1, it just goes crazy. You've got tense errors, the wrong verb, agreement errors, word order errors, inflection errors, and then it calms down again. B2, and you see flatlining again. So it gives you a troubling picture for B1 level when we look at errors at in the past simple. But really, it's hiding something really important, because when you look at what they actually can do at A1 compared to what they can do at B1 level with the past simple, you may not be able to see this, but the important thing that you can see here is that A2, they can do two things, or sorry, at A1, they can do two things with the past simple. They can make the affirmative form with a limited vocabulary range of regular or irregular verbs. The regular versus irregular isn't the issue, is that they have a set amount of vocabulary at that level, and that they can use it to talk about everyday events or states in the past. So if you remember, they haven't, the error rate is not very high, but they have such a limited use of it at A1. Okay, but then by B1 they can do so much more. You can see 7 different uses there, like the use of the affirmative again, but with a wide range of verbs, and the use of the negative form with an increasing range of verbs, the use of the interrogative form, and they use it for habitual states or actions, using it for imagined situations after if. So with if clauses, using it to order past events, using it to talk about regret. Now, that's a really positive picture of what a B1 learner can do. So by looking at what they can do, you get a much more positive picture. But in trying to do all of this, they make a lot of errors. And so that's what's showing up when you look at the flip side of competency, when you look at all of the misfires, I guess, around these competencies. So that's a really important point, that there are ups and downs when you look at grammar. It's not, learning is never a linear path, as we know well. Just to put that in context of examples and to look at A1 in past simple, we see the use of regular and irregular verbs like she was and I liked. So be and like, they're there. But then when you jump up to B2 level, so let's go right up to B2 level, you have the exact same affirmative form of the past simple. So it's still subject followed by verb with the ed, or the irregular form of the ed. So that's the exact same syntax at B2, but you're finding this is an example of the more sophisticated use of this exact same form. They can use I wondered or I wanted as a politeness structure when making requests and thanking. So I wondered if you could introduce me to someone who knows about how to use a camera so that I will be able to record my trip for you. Or the last one, I wanted to know if the rooms are single or double, if they have showers or if there is room service. So that's a very sophisticated politeness device drawing on a structure that students learned at A1, but it's not a use that an A1 learner has within their repertoire. So this was another thing that we tried to capture beyond the notion that we didn't just tick the box here at A1 and say, past simple affirmative, check. This is the important point. What new things can they do with these structures as they go up the level? So it's a very positive profiling in that sense. It's not about what they can't do, their errors. It's about all the new things they can do competently at each level. Of course, we did find a lot of fossils, keeping the nature theme going here. And one of the big ones that we always show is around uncountable nouns, and because it's a nice example for us to show that, you know, it's an error that seems to stay. Now, if you were to think about it, at what level do you teach uncountable nouns, countable versus uncountable nouns? A2. Maybe a little B1, some of them. So there are many, and you teach them around there. So around A2. But what we're finding is that really the errors don't start to drop off until C1. And there's a good reason for this. At A2, you know fewer nouns, right? As your lexical repertoire grows, the risk of getting the countability wrong grows with the number of nouns that you know. So by C level, by B2, you know lots and lots of nouns, and you take a risk and you often get it wrong about their countability. And it doesn't impede the understanding of what you're saying, but it's an error which has a knock-on effect. So these are the most frequent error-prone uncountable nouns that we find: informations, advices, equipments. They're old friends to you, no doubt. Transports, trainings, homeworks, that's a great one. Knowledges, researches, furnitures, works, spendings, behaviours, softwares, damages, musics, stuffs, countrysides, papers, shoppings, accommodations. Now, what's interesting is they are not words you would be teaching at A2, are they? So when you're teaching countability, most of these are not words that you would be teaching. So I guess in terms of reflecting about syllabus design, going back to some of the structures and grammar points that you taught at earlier levels is an important takeaway point in this. Now, Jill, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I'm just going to take up the battle here. And what if you do get an uncountable noun wrong, then it has ripple effects, doesn't it? Because if you're using informations, you're likely to choose a plural verb with informations. And you may have many in front of it. And so you've got this central error which has a ripple effect both ways. You might say these or those informations. So not only are you getting the noun wrong, but you're also getting the stuff that comes either side of it wrong because you've got the noun wrong. And one of our suggestions here would be, we've got a list of the most frequent errors. Let's just identify those and tell students about those and, keep recycling them. We tend not to recycle countability at the higher levels. We tend to, I think, you may contest this, to feel that countability is kind of done and dusted at the lower levels with there is, there are, some and any. But when we see the evidence of the errors, we think, well actually we're going to need to do something with them at higher levels as well. But let's move on to one more thing here, which is about what we found out about the difference between what goes in and what comes out. What we're looking at in the learner corpora and the learner data is what's come out. We have a fair idea of what's gone in, but as we can see from that conditionals example, we don't necessarily know. And so we're very interested on how we measure this, and what the output actually shows. If they've got the output right, that kind of shows an implicit understanding of the grammatical form. But what we tend to do when we teach is just almost test an explicit understanding of a form. And so you might use gap fills or short exercises immediately after a grammatical presentation. But that doesn't necessarily mean, does it, that that learner knows that form. And it's not until it comes out in an implicit environment, thank you, that we can see that form being used correctly. So we're very sort of interested in the fact that we know something grows, we don't necessarily know, and we know that the seed is planted, but we don't necessarily know what's happening in between. So take something like, for example, possessives, which in the Common European Framework and in the Key English Test Handbook is identified. Possessive pronouns are identified here at A2. And all of them are identified at A2. So it's not just mine, it's not just yours, all of them are. And when we looked at the data, the only possessive pronoun that learners could use correctly, accurately, that they could do, was mine. And it wasn't until we got to C2 that we could see learners using theirs correctly. So are we asking our learners to jump through hoops which they're not ready for? Yeah, that's another possibility. So this is really a quick whiz through all of these things. You know, we'd have time to debate them in a lot more detail in a longer session, but just a few pointers. So what we're kind of concluding here is that we might plant these little seeds individually and they might start to grow, but actually they end up being much more like this and more of a jungle than actually nice, neat lines. That we end up not seeing a grammatical feature being taught and done. It's not a series of these discrete items. It's more like this, where you've got something like a pronoun. Let's give this as an example. Pronoun plus will plus main verb, that structure. And at A1 we might see that being used for future arrangements. If you can't see it, it's I'll come to see you tomorrow. At B1 we can also add predictions to that. As soon as you finish your school, it'll be harder to meet your old friends. At C1 we've got this more specialised use, a habitual use of will. And at C2 we can see this use which has had a kind of a disapproval meaning about it. So we can see this same form developing all the way through. Now had we stopped at A1 and said, right, they can do it there, we would have missed all of this fine-grained data that we've got here. So I'll just move back to Anne to sum it all up, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions.
Okay. I don't want to neglect this side of the audience. So really, we hope that the resource, which is freely available for you to look up and use, that it will give the bigger picture on grammar, a profile, an evidence base of student learning, what students can do that didn't exist before. So it's also very fine-grained evidence, as Jill said. It's not just ticking off structures once off at a particular level, like past simple ticked off at A1 in affirmative form. We bring it right through all the levels in terms of the different competencies, functions, pragmatic functions that the structure is being used for as they go up the CEFR. It's also potentially a tool as a type of gap analysis, providing evidence of where more teaching is needed. And I think we've shown you a few examples there around countable nouns is a particularly strong example there. So it allows you to see where the gaps are. Well, I thought we covered that, and learners are not really showing competency in that form until the next level. Then it would help you prioritize in terms of syllabus design that you should be giving more attention to this. Equally, the conditionals example and the third conditional was there at B1. Now, believe me, one of the reviewers who was involved in this process, who's sitting in the room and laughing at this point, questioned us a number of times, are you sure? Are you sure? So we went back a number of times to double check that. You know, that it identified competencies that were there earlier at times, but very often items that came later, much later in terms of when they are typically taught. So that also brings us to this notion of the lag between teaching and learning. And we need to, I suppose, use the resource in that way. It tells you what the learners know at a particular level. That's not telling you when to teach it. It's just telling you what they know at what level. So it may be a level back when you should be teaching it to allow enough time for this to become automatic and implicit. Because the explicit teaching and learning of the grammar, like learning how to drive a car, you can explicitly know and learn how to drive a car in theory, but it takes a lot of practice to make that automatic and implicit. So the amount of time between working back from our profile, how much time is needed for these structures to become implicit and for students to use them and show competency in them? So that's an interesting question that it raises for us. And finally then, we didn't get to talk about it, but it would be really interesting for you if you're involved in teaching advanced learners. If you look at the advanced grammar syllabi across course books, people struggle to think of what to teach advanced learners in terms of grammar. If you go into C1 and C2 levels, you see a lot of really interesting grammar competencies there, and a lot of them are they're forms that learners already know, but they're much more sophisticated uses of those forms, as in the examples that we gave there with the adverb and adjective, and also the past simple, using the past simple affirmative as a politeness device. I wanted to ask you about, and that's a very sophisticated use. So that's the end of the talk. As I say, we'd encourage you to go have a look, go check it out and see what you think of it and get back to us and make use of it, basically. So go to the English Grammar profile and you click on the English Grammar profile online. Also, of course, you've got the English Vocabulary profile, a little plug for Annette Capel's work, which does a similar structuring for vocabulary. Okay? And that's it.